Uddalaka is a spiritual practitioner. This means he's looking into the reality of what's going on, the reality behind all our notions and concepts and percepts. And he sees that he's had a choice, he's got a choice. He can identify with notions of the body, notions of an individual self, an ego sense. He can identify with his mind, which creates all that. Or he can identify with his own awareness, his underlying consciousness, within which all these finite limitations arise. Uddalaka continued to reflect thus. In reality, consciousness cannot be conditioned. It is unlimited and is subtler than the subtlest atom, hence beyond the influence of mental conditioning. The mind rests in the ego sense and the reflected consciousness in the senses, and from this there arise the illusion of self-limitation of consciousness. So these are the two key things which we tend to identify with: a sense of ourself, an ego sense of our personal identity, and we also identify with what's happening through the senses. We seem to think we're on the receiving end of something. When this is experienced and thought of again and again, the ego sense and the illusion of self-limitation acquire a false validity. But I am consciousness, which is untouched by any of these. Let the body continue to live in a world brought into being by its ignorant activities, or let it abandon it. I am consciousness, unaffected by any of these. Consciousness, being infinite and all-pervading, has no birth, no death, nor is it possessed by anyone. It has nothing to gain by living as a separate entity, since it is all-pervading. Birth and death are mental concepts. They have nothing to do with the self. You might disagree with that. You might think, well, birth and death is going on all around. But that's the story. You're not really getting caught up in it. That's not what's happening within you right now. You might say, you might be pointing to things out there. There's a whole lot of stuff that we can see is going on. There's a whole lot of stories which we can get caught up in, if that's what we want to do. But we've also got the option of not getting caught up in stories. We've got that option. You might think it's being callously indifferent to just call these things stories. But that's not the case at all. That's another story to be getting caught up in. It's just the opposite, in fact. It's just the opposite. Birth and death are mental concepts. They have nothing to do with the self. I think a lot of people might have trouble. Oh, it's just mental concepts. That's what we're saying it is. But the fact is, they have nothing to do with the self. You might want to take some kind of stand against that declaration that birth and death are mental concepts. But what you have to do is ask yourself, what kind of story are you getting caught up in? What kind of drama are you getting caught up in? And what does that drama have to do with yourself, your essential self? And if you want to get caught up in that drama, then there's not really much point in following this teaching or even listening to it. Only that which entertains notions of the ego sense can be grasped and bound. The self is free from the ego sense and is therefore beyond being and non-being. The ego sense is vain delusion. The mind is like a mirage and the objects of the world are inert substances. Who is it that says, I am? The body is an aggregate of flesh, blood, etc. The mind vanishes inquiry into its nature. Well, so does the body actually. Self-limitation of consciousness and such other concepts are insentient nonsense. What is the ego? I think perhaps Uddalaka is influenced still by yogic notions which assert the existence of the body. But I think he's managed to get beyond them as well. The senses exist and are engaged in self-satisfying activity all the time. The substances of the world are the substances of the world. Where is the ego? Nature is nature, and its qualities interact on one another, like the sight and light, hearing and sound, etc. And what is rests in itself. Where is the ego? The self, which is consciousness, exists as the supreme self of all, everywhere in all bodies at all times. Not just bodies, but in everything. Who am I? What am I made of? What is my form? Made by whom? And what shall I acquire, and what shall I reject? There is thus nothing which can be called I, and which undergoes being and non-being. When there is no ego sense in truth, how can that ego sense be related, and to whom? When thus it is realized that there is no relationship at all, then the false notion of duality vanishes. Thus whatever there is the one cosmic being, Brahman, or the Self. I am that reality. Why do I suffer in delusion? When one alone exists as the pure omnipresent being, how can there even arise something known as the ego sense? There is no substantiality in any substance in truth. The Self alone exists. Or, even if one assumes the substantiality to be real, there is no relationship between that and the Self. The senses function as senses, the mind exists as mind. The consciousness is untouched by these. What is relationship, and how does it come into being? Just because they exist side by side, it is not right to assume a relationship. A stone and an iron rod may lie side by side, totally unrelated to each other. So this is the old story of the crow alighting on the branch of the tree, the palm tree, and at that point a coconut falls, and we assume that there's a connection between the two. We're making connections and relationships all the time. This is the cognitive process at work. These are the things that build up in our mind, and we say that's reality.